Thank you so much for your words of welcome, and thank you for the privilege of being here. I first became involved with the World Reformed Fellowship in 2014 when I attended the symposium on theological education in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and immensely benefited from that time together. And it's now a great pleasure to be amongst you once again to give a Scottish flavour to what we are celebrating here over the course of these few days. I received 2 emails reminding me not to be too academic or too theological. You must have mistaken me for someone else. There is no danger of either. We can relax, and it's my pleasure to try to trace the thread, the connection between the events that we are celebrating now and what subsequently happened in my part of the world, in Scotland. And I hope that we will find it interesting, but I hope we will be able to give thanks to God for how he continued to lead and guide men and women after the Reformation, as the church continued to develop and continued to expand in strength and in resolve towards world mission. Because that is, after all, the command that Jesus gave to his disciples. If Wittenberg is located at the edge of civilization, Scotland lies on the edge of the universe. At the time of the Reformation, it was only the very bravest that would make the effort to venture into what was uncharted territory and risk the highly dangerous encounters with the natives. Jasper Ridley, in his biography of John Knox, he puts it this way: at the beginning of the 16th century, Scotland was a poor, primitive, and faraway country, which the civilized nations of Europe regarded with contempt and romantic fascination. To the European, Scotland was a weird, barbaric land, inhabited in the north by wild Scots and savages, and ending in a great field of stone and ice, where nothing grew, the land where the devil lived. It was a land of mystery. William Maitland of Lethington complained to William Cecil, Elizabeth's right-hand man, that he lived in a corner of the world separated from the society of men. And James Stewart, Earl of Moray, wrote to the Elector Palatine that in Scotland he was almost beyond the limits of the human race. There is something within me that takes perverse pride in reading such a description of my barbaric ancestors, particularly when I compare it with the contribution which the Scots have subsequently made to the world in medicine, finance, politics, technology, and so on and so forth. But our particular interest today lies in how the Reformation impacted Scotland, and in tracing that, if we can, how it impacted Scotland's contribution to world mission. To do that is no easy thing. For one thing, it took over 200 years for all of this to happen. So the title of my lecture today would be Long Story Short. I want to trace how this same remote, isolated, backward, and primitive pagan corner of Europe became so transformed and shaped by the gospel that by the middle of the 19th century, dozens and dozens of missionaries were being sent out to other lands to bring the message of the good news to men and women who were yet to hear it. I want us to see how God moved in Scotland since it was first impacted by the Reformation, and how a remarkable ecclesiological development resulted in the most astonishing missionary movement, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. But I don't want just to note these events, I want to connect them in order to be true to the title I've been given. It took over 200 years for the Protestant Reformed Church in Scotland to develop, such that, moved by love for the lost, Scotland was ready to send out missionaries. It might be asked, in such a long time frame, is there any verifiable connection between 1517 and the early 19th century? Well, I believe that there is. It might be hard at times to determine and to identify, but with the hindsight of history, it can be shown how the church matured during those years, and in the same time, under the extraordinary power of God, became a church that was on fire for the gospel despite all its difficulties. Let's go back then to 1517. The Lutheran protest in 1517 immediately impacted Scotland in two notable ways. One was the ministry of Patrick Hamilton. He was a Scot who studied in Paris, and while there came into contact with the teaching of Erasmus and Luther. Having returned to Scotland, he began to further embrace the teachings of the Reformation. An inquiry into him in 1527 resulted in him having to leave Scotland again, this time to travel here to Wittenberg, before returning to his home, where he unashamedly preached the good news. In January 1528, the church summoned him and found him guilty of heresy. He was condemned and burned to death on the 29th of February 1528. His death, rather than extinguishing interest in the Reformation, only served to ignite it further. It was said that the odor of Master Patrick Hamilton has infected as many as it blew upon. A second immediate consequence of the initial Reformation was the influx of literature, which had a profound effect on Scottish society, as indeed noted by John Knox in his History of the Reformation. He says, quote, "The knowledge of God did wondrously increase within this realm, partly by reading, partly by brotherly conference, in which in those dangerous days, these conferences were used to the comfort of many, but chiefly by merchants and mariners who, frequenting other countries, heard the true doctrine affirmed and the vanity of the papistical religion openly rebuked." Close quote. Despite every attempt made by the church to eradicate this influence, interest in the Reformation only increased and eventually became focused in the figure of John Knox. Knox had originally been a bodyguard of another of Scotland's great martyrs, George Wishart. And after Wishart's death in March 1546 and the revenge killing of Cardinal Beaton, he had joined the group of men who had gathered in St. Andrews. And there he was persuaded to preach, his gifts having become evident to those who were there. A siege of St. Andrews by the French resulted in Knox being taken prisoner in 1547, and for 18 months he was a galley slave on French ships. He was released into England in 1549 and preached in the north during the reign of Edward VI. But when Mary Tudor came to the English throne, Knox, with many others, fled to the continent. There he met Calvin and other reformers. And after a brief and unhappy pastorate in Frankfurt, he returned to Geneva, where he ministered during Calvin's time there. I want to stop here because what this meant was that by the time that Scotland officially embraced the Reformed faith in 1560, the Reformation had moved on. Remember that Knox was only 4 years old in 1517 when Luther nailed the 95 Theses here in Wittenberg. So it's 40 years before Scotland officially embraced the Reformation. And by that time, the doctrine, worship, and practice adopted by the Scots was distinctly Calvinistic, which means that, for our purposes, any exploration of the impact of the Reformation on Scotland must take into account the particular characteristics of the Calvinistic strain of the Reformation, which begs the immediate question, is Calvin and mission either historically or theologically compatible? We have to answer that question before going any further, because if the answer is no, then we might as well stop now. John Knox had spent time in Geneva with Calvin. For Knox, this period was the happiest in his life. He regarded Geneva as the most perfect school of Christ that ever was on the earth since the days of the apostles. But the question remains, was Calvin or Geneva or both, were they missional as well as being reformative? This is an important question because for some, Calvin and mission are a contradiction in terms. Several modern missiologists maintain that Calvin and other Protestant reformers in the 16th century lacked missionary concern. And I quote three of them. Gustav Warneck, in Outline of a History of Protestant Missions, he says this, and I quote, "There was no recognition in Calvin of the church having a duty, or the church having a duty to send out missionaries." Robert Hall Glover, once director of China Inland Mission, writes in his book, he, again, I quote, "showed a remarkable ignorance of the scope of the divine plan and of a Christian duty in relation to the gospel." He's talking about the reformers. In like manner, C. Gordon Olson, in his book, What in the World is God Doing? He says, and I quote, "When all the argument is done, the embarrassing fact remains. For 2 centuries, Protestant leaders did virtually nothing to advance the cause of world evangelization." In analyzing these criticisms, again, I'm going to refer to someone who was referred to by Dr. Carson, his colleague, Dr. Scott Manich. He comments, "In this popular assessment, then, Calvin and other early reformers were guilty of a great omission rather than committed to the Great Commission." Is this correct? Manich says, no, it's not. He goes on in a recent paper to refute such a suggestion by saying that even a casual reading of Calvin's Institutes affirms that for him the gospel was to be preached to all. For example, Book 3, 20, 40, 41 and 42, quote, "We should desire to make it at least the subject of our prayers every day, that God may gather churches to himself from all quarters of the world." Manich also goes on to analyze Calvin by saying, quote, "God not only predestines certain men and women to salvation, but also assigns the means by which the elect hear and believe the glad tidings of salvation. Christian preachers therefore must proclaim the gospel indiscriminately, not knowing whom from their audience the Lord has chosen from eternity." End quote. It is therefore not accurate to claim that because of an insistence upon divine sovereignty in salvation, Calvinism is not compatible with the free offer of the gospel. I'll say more about this later on as history unfolds within the Scottish scene. That being said, is there evidence that Calvin's Geneva was missional? And this is important because it had such an importance on the thinking of John Knox. Again, I quote Dr. Scott Manich. He addresses this question by focusing on work done by Robert Kingdon, who documented a top-secret campaign by Calvin and the Reformed ministers in Geneva to recruit, to train and send missionary pastors into Catholic France. Between 1555 and 1570, around 220 pastors were sent secretly into France to plant churches and evangelize the towns and villages of the French kingdom. Some of them died as Protestant martyrs. Yet the campaign met with enormous success, with around 1,240 Protestant churches planted within this time frame. But was such a campaign mission? Yes. Manich again, he insists that for 16th century Protestants, Catholic Europe was a mission field in need of evangelization. In their view, Europe did not simply need to be renewed, it needed to be re-Christianized. The goal, in the words of another writer, Scott Hendricks, was Christianizing Christendom, because the message of the gospel of grace had all been eradicated in favor of blatant idolatry and corruption. Reformation was itself a missionary movement on a grand scale. It is therefore difficult to believe that, having been so influenced by Calvin's Geneva during part of this time frame, John Knox's perception of Reformation was not also missional. Indeed, there is evidence in his history of the Reformation that mission was going on even before the Reformation came to light. He tells us of faithful friars who preached the gospel as early as 1538, even by such innovative means as a passion play. In this, Knox comments, all things were so lively expressed that the very simple people understood and confessed. Knox goes on to describe at times of great blessing in Scotland during his time in exile, particularly in 1557, when he says, the gospel of Jesus began wondrously to flourish. How was that possible, if not by the faithful, spirit-filled preaching of the gospel? The Reformation came about in Scotland because of this faithfulness and because of the enthusiasm and the commitment of those who had been touched by the simple truth that in Christ alone our hope is found. In 1560, the mission of the church, and this is of course the year when Scotland officially adopted the Reformation, the mission of the church was consolidation and organization. The immediate task was to regularize its worship, doctrine, and practice, to educate its own people away from the superstitions of Rome and into a biblical mindset. Simple, regular practices like the sacraments, Lord's Day worship, and everyday Christian life had to be revisited in the light of the Bible. Was the Scottish Reformation then missional? Yes, it was. The task was to re-Christianize Scotland by educating people and congregation in the simple truths of the gospel. And that meant a process of development. What's more, the language of the documents that accompanied the Scottish Reformation sometimes make this clear. In the first book of Discipline in 1560, it calls the church to pray that God would thrust out faithful workmen into this, his harvest. It calls for the appointments of superintendents who would plant and erect churches and to appoint ministers. The Scots Confession, written at the same time as a statement of faith, begins with, "And this glad tidings of the kingdom shall be preached throughout the whole world for a witness to all nations, and then shall the end come." The task then was organizational, but the assumption was the preaching of the gospel in every parish with a specific view to the spread of the gospel everywhere. For Scotland, Reformation was never envisaged as a momentary movement. John Knox, regarded as the principal leader, he died a frustrated man because for him the Reformation had hardly begun, and even what had been achieved was in great danger of disintegrating if left in the wrong hands. And fall back it did, at least partially. The progress of continued Reformation was desperately slow as the church struggled over continuous pressure to conform to the demands of rulers in their attempts to rule over the church. After Knox died in 1572, the task that faced the church was its own survival, and that task lasted 120 years. Each successive monarch attempted in his own way to assert authority over the church, with the prospect of a backward trajectory into Rome never far away. The attempts by Charles I to impose his liturgy over the church in Scotland met with fierce resistance in the form of the National Covenant, and later the Solemn League and Covenant, which sought to unify the Protestant church in England and Scotland under the Westminster Confession of Faith. At the Westminster Assembly, at which Scots made their own contribution, we're once again asking if there's any evidence of a worldwide gospel purpose. Here, the best minds of the Reformed Church from England, Scotland, and Ireland, and elsewhere were gathered. Their task was to agree on a mission statement, a comprehensive and cohesive declaration about what they believe. The focus was theological. Nonetheless, within some of their documents, there are glimpses of missional incentive. For example, the larger catechism, number 191, and in the second petition, talking about the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come. We pray that the kingdom of sin and Satan may be destroyed. The gospel propagated throughout the world. The Jews called, the fullness of the Gentiles brought in, and the building up of those that are already converted, that Christ would hasten the time of his coming. Charles II, in his ruthless attempts to bring the church into line with his insistence upon his own liturgy, he resorted to full-scale war against the Scots, who refused such attempts. These violent times came to an end in 1688 with the glorious revolution under William. This was the threshold of the 18th century. You see what I mean by long story short. But it heralded a new dawn in the history of the Protestant church in Scotland. The violent persecution which had so marked the latter years of the 17th century were now at an end, and the church could look forward to more peaceful times. But that peace was uneasy. Tension still existed politically and socially across the nation. But tensions also existed within the Presbyterian church itself. The challenge of the Enlightenment age had a strong bearing on the church, which came to realize that it could no longer presuppose the age-old institutions which previously constituted the bedrocks of the known world. In 1707, Scotland and England were brought together. That too proved to be a challenging adjustment for the Scots. One might imagine that in such an uneasy period, an unwelcoming environment, any missionary impetus would eventually fade out. In fact, it was the opposite. Interest and zeal for mission among ordinary Christians was never so high, right across the now United Kingdom. I want to look at this briefly at this century, the 18th century, and to try and identify 4 features of this century which I think focused the minds of the Scots more towards what became the missional movement of the 19th century. First of all, and again, this may be somewhat controversial because it's perhaps a little bit difficult to prove, but nevertheless, for discussion in any case, I'm going to mention a controversy that arose at the beginning of the 18th century, towards the beginning, which is known as the Morrow Controversy. There were two factions within the Protestant church at that time. There was the faction that prided itself in purity of doctrine, but which became neo-nomian. They wanted to emphasize repentance and good works as a condition of true faith. The other faction was accused of being antinomian and universalist, and they stressed the gospel as a gift that was unconditionally offered and that was unconditionally accepted. It came to the surface over the republication of a book called The Marrow of Modern Divinity, written earlier by an Englishman called Edward Fisher, but rediscovered by Thomas Boston. This book was dynamite because it presented the gospel in bold and unreserved language that offended the more established department of the church. The upshot was that the General Assembly of 1720 condemned the book and scolded those who approved of it. But at the heart of the issue lay a statement in the book in which the gospel was presented thus: "Go and tell all men everywhere, without exception, Christ is dead for him. And if he will take him and accept of his righteousness, he shall have him." What you have is a controversy over the terms of the gospel, what exactly it meant to come to faith in Jesus. It was a definition of faith and the gift of eternal life in the gospel. It was about being right with God. It was a return, in a way, to the very issues that gave rise to the Reformation itself, albeit expressed in different language. The Morrow Controversy was once again a discussion over the terms and the substance of the gospel. And although there is little evidence to link this controversy with the missionary impetus that followed, I can't help but make the connection. So do at least three others. One is George Morrison, who says that this book had an enormous impact because loads of people read it. It would be interesting, he says, to trace the influences of the Morrow and the Morrow Controversy upon religious Scotland. The book was read by multitudes and proved to many a light struck up in the darkness. Men caught the echoes in the preaching of George Whitefield. And if the nation was at all in readiness for the evangelical revival of the succeeding century, directly and indirectly, the Morrow has played its part in that. The theologian T.F. Torrance also says the theological direction which they took did lead them. This is the Morrow men, those who supported the teaching of the book, did lead them to take more seriously the command of Christ to go into all the world and preach the gospel, which was a return to the manifesto of the Scots Confession. Another one is James Walker. He says that Boston and the Morrow men, first of all among our divines, entered fully into the missionary spirit of the Bible. So that was the Morrow Controversy. Other things were happening around about the same time. The establishment of the Scottish Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge happened in 1709, 2 years after the Union. Scotland had its own mission field, the North. And the church saw an opportunity, or Christians saw an opportunity, to go into the north of Scotland and to educate them with a view to them becoming familiar with the gospel. It was set up to instruct the people, note, in the Christian Reformed Protestant religion. The society therefore continued the clear stream of Reformed tradition which issued from its fountainhead at Geneva. In 1730, things developed in that society. In order to fulfill its commitment, it supported several missionaries to the North American Indians, including the celebrated David Brainerd. And in 1735, it sent John MacLeod from the Isle of Skye to minister to Gaelic speakers in Georgia. This great society formed a rallying ground for earnest evangelicals in the church, and it was to be followed later on that same century by other societies, and we'll talk about these later on. But then thirdly, there was a great revival that broke out as part of the Great Awakening. And I refer particularly to the Cambuslang revival. Cambuslang is a town just outside of Glasgow. And in 1741, a great revival broke out. On one occasion, the preacher George Whitefield spoke to 30,000 people. And there was an extraordinary movement of the gospel in that area. But it also led to a further development of missionary impetus. An integral feature of the revival was the prevalence of prayer for the spread of the knowledge of Christ throughout the world. But then fourthly, there is the central figure of John Erskine, who lived from 1721 to 1803, and who was the leader of the evangelical party within the Church of Scotland. Erskine is a lesser known person in Scottish church history, and he deserves a whole lot more attention than he typically gets. Perhaps there was nobody in this period who did more by his activity and his preaching and writing to inspire his fellow Scots to support mission abroad. But he wrote one particular work which is thought by some academics to be his most seminal and most inspirational and most earth-shattering work, and it's called The Nature of Saving Faith. And in this work, Erskine, he examines, he scrutinizes our understanding of what saving faith actually is. He dissects it, and he uncovers, he takes away the layers of assumption that had built up within the Scottish church over the years, an assumption which had become quite dangerous and had led many to believe that they were believers, when after reading and after the influence of this work, a new discovery was made, and a new kind of preaching emerged, a new enthusiasm and impetus towards evangelistic preaching that no longer assumed that the hearers were Christians because they belonged to the church. Here are some of the things that he says. He says this: love to God is not so much excited by the precept, thou shalt love the Lord thy God, but by discoveries of God's own loveliness and love. A belief, he says, that the Father sent the Son to be the Savior implies a belief that the world needed such salvation. Such a knowledge of God cannot but influence our dispositions and actions. Even the faith of devils affects them. The devils believe and tremble. Had men such an apprehension of God's revealed character as devils have of his severity, it would draw forth love, reverence, and thankfulness, and animate to a cheerful discharge of every duty. This sermon was a game changer in Scotland. Some academics, like my colleague Dr. John McIntosh, believes that this was the single seminal moment when preaching in Scotland changed and when there was a new approach to evangelism and evangelistic thinking. And that was, in short, because his sermon appeared to penetrate further than what was comfortable for many within the ecclesiastical world. He was concerned to resolve the problems posed by earlier writers who defined faith in terms which looked suspiciously like a mere intellectual assent. John Erskine is best known for a speech that he made at a General Assembly in 1796. And at that assembly, a request had been made that the church would give support to the missionary societies that were now established within Scotland. And there were two factions. We love a good argument in Scotland, and that spills out often into General Assemblies. And this was one of the most famous arguments that ever took place within the church in Scotland, 1796. Because some didn't want to give such support. And the argument was that you can't go to the heathen with the gospel. You have to refine the heathen first. They have to become educated before they can accept the teachings of the gospel. The Apostle Paul didn't speak to the ignorant heathen. He spoke to the refined, the educated, the polished. That was the argument that was being put forth in opposition to supporting such a venture. At last, John Erskine got up to speak. And I can imagine the silence that there must have been throughout, across the hundreds of men gathered, wondering how he was going to respond to such an argument. His opening words were this: "Moderator, give me that Bible." He took the Bible and then he preached from Acts chapter 28, which showed that the kind of people that Paul preached the gospel to there were precisely the kind of people that the mission societies were so eager to send missionaries to. The upshot was that that assembly moved against Erskine and the evangelicals, but they promised that should such opportunity occur in the future, that they would revisit the issue. It was to be 28 years before that promise was fulfilled. But in that 28 years, the following were born. God was moving behind closed doors, behind the official church structures. John Wilson, John Anderson, Alexander Duff, David Livingston, Alexander Somerville, William Chalmers Burns, John Peyton, all of whom would serve God in mighty ways in mission in India, Africa, China, and the New Hebrides. During this time, these societies for mission proliferated, and up to 60 were created across Scotland between 1795 and 1825. Time does not allow us, and I'm conscious of the time, to explore the testimonies of the many persons who went out with the gospel. One should be mentioned, though, and it's not David Livingston, believe it or not. It is Alexander Duff. He was taught by Thomas Chalmers, and he was inspired by him. Having felt an overwhelming call as a young man, he was sent as the first official ministry of the Church of Scotland to establish a mission centre in Bengal. By sending him, the church was at last affirming its commitment to international outreach. Duff became a living legend within Christian circles at that time, elevating mission to the top of the church's agenda and raising huge sums of resource for the advancement of the work in India and elsewhere. I'm going to move on now to a conclusion, because from that there ensued the Scottish missionary movement, which took place in the 19th century, and particularly in the first half of that century, where men and women were sent out from Scotland to many parts of the world, many parts of Africa, many parts of India, the Far East, Japan, China, not to mention Jewish missions that were associated with Andrew Bonar and Robert Murray McChain, and so on. I was tempted so much to go into the detail, but that's not what we're about this morning. It's about tracing the link between the Reformation and the development of Scottish mission. We have attempted to identify the thread that runs from the Reformation into Scottish mission. And there are so many issues that could be raised, issues of interest. We could further explore to what extent the Reformation sought to fulfill the Great Commission, and whether the Reformation of the medieval church was itself a mission. We could ask whether the provision of education as part of the Reformation in Scotland was an essential element in the work of the church. Provision of education became a characteristic of the Scots Reformation, but it continued into a characteristic of Scots mission. The Scottish missionary theory was that education was uppermost in the provision of gospel ministry to places like India under Alexander Duff. That itself is a debatable question because it proved to be controversial in its time. We could ask so many questions, and I'm sure each one of them would take up an hour in itself. But I want to return to, in closing, to the subject that I've been given, and I want to leave the last words to two people, the first of whom is someone I've quoted before, T.F. Torrance, and he recognizes that link. He says this: with the Reformation, there had developed a biblical theology which had an increasingly significant place in the parishes through the preaching and teaching of the gospel by generations of ministers who had been trained to read the scriptures in their original languages. So for Torrance, the church's mission is the preaching of the gospel in individual parishes in a robust and an educated and in a profound manner. As a result, he says, there developed an expository and biblical theology which had an increasing impact on the church, molding its basic theological outlook and reinforcing its evangelical commitment and mission. We definitely need to ask, when we come to asking about mission today, if zeal for evangelism where are the mission opportunities today, and how can we take the rich legacy that we have acquired from the Reformation and apply it missionally and evangelistically today? And as never before, that question needs to be asked. But if zeal for evangelization does not exist within our churches, we have to ask how to address that. If it does not, then our modern Luthers and Calvins and Knoxes must minister to our people in such a way as to reignite that zeal. But it's not by nagging our people. It is by presenting them with the profound truths of the Reformation, in which our people will once again be stirred to see that this world is not our lasting home. Or in the words of Erskine, and with him I close, does gratitude to God enlarge the heart to run in the ways of God's commandments? Surely the unspeakable gift of the Son of God tends above everything else to excite that gratitude. The love of Christ constrains us thus to judge. All the evils that men or devils can threaten, all the pomp and pleasure and the wealth the world can promise seem contemptible. They disappear. They're utterly annihilated by a view of our obligations to redeeming love. This will beget strength of resolution and firmness and fortitude in actually doing or suffering for the cause of Christ. That is the link. That is the connection between the fire of the reformers and the fire of those who are determined to preach Christ to every nation. Thank you.